The sharp, synchronized click of 20 pairs of leather boots against the marble floor was the only sound in the Gangnam Luxury Mall, until the glass shattered. Amorous Veil hit the floor hard, her modest navy maid's uniform a dark stain against the glittering white tiles. Around her lay the wreckage of a 10-foot Christmas tree and the scattered, broken remnants of ornaments that cost more than her annual salary. Above her stood a group of socialites, their laughter curling into sneers as they looked down at the invisible woman they had just shoved into the display. For a heartbeat, the festive opulence of the mall felt like a tomb. Amorous looked up, her breath hitching as she saw the predatory glint in their eyes. They thought she was just a servant. They thought she was a nobody with no one to call. They had no idea that they hadn't just tripped a maid, they had just insulted the only woman who had ever seen the coldest mafia boss of Soul Bleed. They had no idea about the secret night in the Cheon estate when the shadows fell away, and the man who refused to marry anyone had whispered her name like a prayer. They didn't know that under her simple uniform, her heart beat in sync with a man who commanded the city's underworld with an iron fist. And they definitely didn't see the tall, stern figure in the long black coat rounding the corner, his fists clenched and his eyes radiating a level of dominance that made the air itself turn to ice. Cheon Min-jae. Beside him walked his mother, the icy Oh Siren, her gaze dropping to the floor to see her most trusted maid humiliated. The socialite smiles began to wither as the intimidating formation of men in tailored black suits flanked Amorous, their expressions cold and controlled. As Minji's shadow fell over her, his voice, usually a frozen blade, broke the silence with a low, dangerous rumble that sent a shiver through the crowd. Who touched her? In that moment, as realization began to drain the color from her tormentors' faces, they understood. They hadn't just bullied a maid, they had declared war on a king. And by the time the mall security gates were locked down on Minji's silent command, they were going to learn that some people are invisible not because they are weak, but because they are protected by a monster. Before we dive into this tale of forbidden passion, hidden worlds, and the maid who melted a frozen heart, do me a favor, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single moment of this dramatic journey. Now, let's get into it. In the sprawling, minimalist halls of the Cheon estate, Amorous Veil was less than a person, she was a shadow that smelled of lemon polish and expensive laundry starch. To the rest of the world, the Cheon family was a fortress of steel and blood, but to Amorous, they were the architects of a silent, rigid world she had occupied for 2 years. Her life was measured in the rhythmic ticking of grand clocks and the soft scuff of her sensible shoes against polished obsidian floors. She moved through the mansion with a practiced, bowed head, her dark skin a contrast to the icy, white marbled walls. As Oh Siren's personal maid, Amorous was the keeper of secrets she was never meant to speak. She knew how the matriarch liked her tea, scalding and bitter, much like the woman herself, and she knew exactly which silken handbox were reserved for days when the family business required an extra layer of intimidation. But it was Cheon Min-jae who made the air in the house feel heavy, like a storm that refused to break. He was a man of jagged edges and frozen silences. Every morning at precisely 6 a.m., Amorous would set his coffee on the mahogany desk in his study. She never looked him in the eye. She focused on the steam rising from the cup, on the way his large, scarred hands gripped the morning reports, and on the terrifying aura of power that radiated from him. He was the man who had publicly refused the daughters of billionaires and politicians, earning him the title of the coldest king in Seoul's underworld. To him, marriage was a weakness, a leash he refused to wear. Amorous believed she was invisible to him. She was just the girl who smoothed his sheets and vanished into the servants' quarters before the sun went down. She told herself the fluttering in her chest when he entered a room was fear, not the dangerous spark of a woman noticing a man. She convinced herself that the way he sometimes paused when she walked past was merely him checking for a speck of dust she might have missed. In the quiet of her small room at night, Amorous would look at her hands, worn from labor but steady, and wonder what it felt like to be seen. She didn't want jewels or titles, she wanted to be more than a ghost in a navy dress. She had no way of knowing that behind his closed study door, Minji's eyes followed her silhouette through the frosted glass, his cold heart beginning to crack under the weight of a secret obsession he couldn't name. She was the invisible girl, but for the most dangerous man in Korea, she was becoming the only thing worth looking at. The shift in their universe didn't happen with a bang, but in the heavy, suffocating silence of a summer storm that had knocked out the power to the Cheon estate. It was 3 in the morning when Amaris was jolted awake by the insistent ringing of the service bell from the library. She stumbled through the pitch-black corridors, a small candle flickering in her hand, thinking Siren had been struck by a sudden ailment. Instead, she found Min Jae. He wasn't the polished, terrifying statue she saw every morning. He was slumped on the floor against his mahogany desk, a half-empty bottle of amber liquid beside him and a jagged, bleeding gash across his knuckles. He had clearly been in a fight, one he hadn't let his doctors see. The candlelight caught the sweat on his brow and the raw, unmasked agony in his eyes. For the first time, the Coldest king looked human. "Sir?" Amaris whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You're hurt. Let me call for the medic." "No medics," he rasped, his voice a low, broken growl. "Just stay." Amaris should have fled. She should have followed the rigid protocols of the house. But the sight of the most powerful man in Seoul looking so utterly alone tethered her to the spot. She knelt beside him, the scent of rain and expensive bourbon filling her lungs. With trembling fingers, she took his large hand in hers. He flinched, not from pain, but from the shock of a touch that wasn't meant to harm or serve, but to comfort. She worked in a trance, using her apron and a bowl of water to clean the wound. Neither of them spoke, but the air between them grew thick, charged with a sudden, electric heat. When she looked up to tell him she was finished, she found him staring at her, not as a maid, but as if she were the only source of light in a world of shadows. "Why don't you ever look at me, Amaris?" he asked, his voice a dangerous, velvet caress. "I'm not supposed to," she breathed, her pulse racing. In one swift, desperate movement, his hand moved from the floor to the back of her neck, pulling her forward. The kiss was a collision of ice and fire, a release of months of suppressed tension. It was hungry, forbidden, and devastatingly thorough. In that darkness, the hierarchy vanished. She wasn't a maid, and he wasn't a boss. They were just two lonely souls finding a temporary home in each other. When the dawn light finally began to creep through the curtains, the mask returned, and the silence was restored. But as Amaris hurried back to her quarters, her lips swollen and her heart permanently altered, she knew the invisible line had been crossed. The cold had been broken, and neither of them would ever be the same again. In the days that followed that volcanic night in the library, the temperature within the Cheon estate didn't just drop, it froze. The sun rose over Seoul with a deceptive warmth, but inside the mansion's walls, Cheon Min-jae had rebuilt his fortress of ice, stone by jagged stone. When Amaris entered his study the next morning, her heart was a wild, fluttering thing, still aching from the ghost of his touch. She had expected a look, a lingering silence, perhaps even a word to acknowledge the fire they had shared in the dark. Instead, she was met with a man made of granite. Min-jae didn't even look up from his tablet. He was dressed in a charcoal suit so sharp it looked like armor, his hair slicked back with clinical precision. "The coffee is late, Amaris," he said. His voice wasn't the velvet growl of the previous night, it was a dead, hollow sound that made her feel more like a ghost than ever before. "Don't let it happen again." The rejection was a physical blow. Amaris stood frozen for a second, her fingers twitching with the urge to reach out and see if the man she had held was still beneath that expensive wool. But the way he shifted his papers, deliberately ignoring her presence, told her everything. To him, that night was a lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness to be buried and forgotten. He was the Coldest king again, and she was back to being the girl who polished his shadows. However, as the week progressed, the tension became a living entity. Min-jae was colder, yes, but he was also more present. He began to appear in rooms he usually avoided. He would stand at the top of the grand staircase, his gaze burning into the back of Amoros's head as she scrubbed the foyer, only to turn away the moment she looked up. He was a man at war with himself, trying to starve an obsession that was clearly only growing hungrier. He wasn't the only one watching. Siren's sharp, feline eyes began to narrow whenever Amoros entered a room. The matriarch noticed the way her son's jaw tightened when the maid's name was mentioned. She saw the way Amoros moved with a new, heavy-hearted grace. One afternoon, while Amoros was arranging lilies in the drawing room, Siren walked in, her heels clicking like a countdown. She didn't speak, she simply watched Amoros with a look of quiet, icy judgment that suggested she could smell the scent of her son's forbidden kiss lingering on the girl's skin. The house was no longer a place of quiet service, it was a powder keg. Minji's silence was a scream, Siren's gaze was a threat, and Amoros was caught in the center, waiting for the spark that would blow their world apart. She tried to return to being invisible, but once a king has looked at you that way, the shadows no longer offer any protection. The holiday season arrived in Seoul not with warmth, but with a glittering, artificial brightness that felt like a mockery of Amoros's hollow chest. The Cheon estate was transformed into a winter palace, dripping in crystal garlands and towering fir trees that smelled of pine and expensive expectations. But for Amoros, the festive cheer was merely a backdrop for her deepening isolation. Minjae remained a phantom of ice, moving through the halls like a winter wind, while Siren's silence had sharpened into something lethal. On a Tuesday morning that felt colder than the rest, the matriarch summoned Amoros to the grand solar. Siren sat silhouetted against the frosted windows, a list of errands held in her manicured hand like a royal decree. The gala is in 2 days, and the boutique has failed to deliver the custom cufflinks for my son, Siren said, her voice a low, melodic threat. Furthermore, the charity auction requires the jade ornaments I had commissioned. You will go to the Gangnam Luxury Mall and collect them personally. Do not return until every item is secured. It was a strange request. Usually, such tasks were handled by the security detail or the head butler, but Amoros didn't dare question it. She donned her modest navy maid's dress and a thin wool coat, looking every bit the servant she was paid to be. She felt a strange sense of foreboding as she stepped into the sleek black car that would take her into the heart of the city's most opulent district. The Gangnam Luxury Mall was a cathedral of consumerism, blinding in its decadence. Towering Christmas trees reaching toward the vaulted glass ceiling were draped in thousands of hand-blown glass ornaments, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts and designer perfumes. Amoros felt the weight of her uniform more heavily here than ever before. Amidst the sea of furs, silks, and diamonds, she was a smudge of dark ink on a pristine white page. She moved through the crowds, clutching the list tightly. People didn't just look past her, they moved as if she were a ghost, their shopping bags brushing against her with indifferent force. She felt small, vulnerable, and dangerously exposed. Every time she caught her reflection in a shop window, she saw the invisible girl staring back, her dark skin and simple attire marking her as an outsider in this playground of the elite. She had just reached the center of the mall, beneath a massive chandelier that cast dancing light over a display of porcelain angels, when the feeling of being watched became a physical pressure on her neck. She looked toward the upper balcony, half expecting to see Minji's cold, brooding gaze. Instead, she saw a group of socialites leaning over the railing, their eyes fixed on her with a cruel, hungry recognition. The trap was set, the ornaments were sparkling, and the Christmas task was about to become a nightmare. The air in the atrium seemed to thin as the group of socialites descended from the mezzanine, their laughter sharp enough to cut through the festive carols playing overhead. Leading them was Chloe Park, a woman whose family had long tried to broker a marriage alliance with the Cheon syndicate. She stopped a few feet from Amoros, her eyes raking over the navy maid's uniform with a look of pure, concentrated venom. I thought the mall had a strict policy against bringing the trash inside, Chloe said, her voice carrying across the hushed floor. Amoros kept her head down, clutching the list of errands to her chest. I am here on official business for Lady Siren. Please, let me pass. Official business? Another woman jeered, stepping forward to block Amarys's path. You're a servant, honey. You don't have business, you have chores. And you're in our way. Amarys tried to sidestep them, but Chloe's hand shot out, grabbing Amarys's shoulder with bruising force. With a violent shove, she sent Amarys stumbling back into a towering display of hand-painted porcelain ornaments. The crash was deafening. Amarys hit the floor, her palms slicing open on the jagged shards of a $1,000 angel. The spilled shopping bags from the boutique she had already visited were kicked aside, their contents tumbling into the slush of melting snow and shattered glass. Look at you, Chloe hissed, leaning down so only Amarys could hear. A little black bird playing dress-up in a palace. Did you think one night in his bed made you a queen? You're a stain on the Chion name, and today, I'm going to make sure everyone sees it. Amarys looked up, her vision blurring with tears of shame and pain. Blood from her palms stained the white marble, and the surrounding crowd, the wealthy, the elite, the beautiful, simply watched. Some pulled out their phones to record the spectacle, while others whispered behind gloved hands. For a moment, Amarys felt the familiar, crushing weight of her own insignificance. She was back in the dirt, just as the world intended. Clean it up, Chloe commanded, pointing to the mess of glass and blood. Get on your knees and show us how well you've been trained. As Amarys began to reach for a shard of glass, her body trembling with the effort to remain composed, a sudden, heavy silence rippled through the mall. It wasn't the silence of curiosity, it was the silence of terror. The mall's grand entrance doors hissed open, and the temperature in the room didn't just drop, it plummeted. Amarys froze as a familiar, rhythmic stride echoed against the stone, followed by the heavy, synchronized footsteps of 20 men who moved like a single, lethal shadow. The king had arrived, and he wasn't alone. The festive carols died mid-note, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against the atrium. The shoppers who had been filming with their phones slowly lowered them, their expressions shifting from morbid curiosity to visceral dread. At the mall's grand entrance, a phalanx of men in razor-sharp black suits moved in terrifying unison, their presence dousing the mall's warmth like a bucket of ice water. At the front of the formation, Cheon Min-jae didn't walk, he reclaimed the space with every predatory stride. His long black coat flared behind him, and his gloved hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists. Beside him, Oh Seerin walked with the chilling elegance of a winter queen, her eyes scanning the wreckage of the display with a look of lethal disappointment. Chloe Park, who had just been sneering at Amarys, felt her knees go weak. Min-jae, she stammered, her voice high and frantic. You're here. I was just, this girl, she was so clumsy, she broke the ornaments and... Min-jae didn't even look at her. He didn't look at the crowd, the security guards, or his mother. His entire world had narrowed down to the small, trembling figure kneeling in the middle of a sea of broken glass. When he saw the blood dripping from Amarys's palms onto the white marble, a low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a sound that promised the end of everything for whoever had caused it. The syndicate members fanned out instantly, forming a human wall that cut the atrium off from the rest of the mall. They stood like statues of obsidian, their hands resting near the holsters hidden beneath their jackets. The message was clear, this was no longer a public space. This was a crime scene, and the king was the judge. Seerin stepped forward, her gaze landing on the navy maid's dress, now torn and stained. I sent you on a simple task, Amarys, she said, her voice a calm, terrifying silk. Then, she turned her icy eyes toward Chloe. And it seems the local vermin have mistaken my household's dignity for a playground. Min-jae reached Amarys, his shadow swallowing her completely. The Coldest boss ignored the glass, ignored the cameras, and ignored his own reputation as he dropped to one knee in the shards. His large, scarred hand hovered near her face, trembling with a rage so potent it made the air vibrate. Amarys, he whispered, the name a jagged plea. Look at me. As she lifted her tear-stained face, the vulnerability in her eyes snapped the final thread of his restraint. He stood up, his height looming over the cowering socialites like an encroaching storm. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. The deadly, quiet resonance of his command echoed to the furthest corners of the mall. Lock the doors. No one leaves until I decide who still gets to have a future. The mall had become a tomb of high-end fashion and low-end terror. Min-jae didn't look at the guards or the gasping crowd, he looked only at Amaris. With a slow, deliberate movement that defied every social law in Korea, the man who refused to marry, the man who held the city in a fist of ice, reached down and slid his arms beneath her. He lifted her from the bed of broken porcelain as if she were made of spun glass. Her blood stained the pristine lapel of his black coat, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled her closer, tucking her head against the hollow of his neck, the same spot where her breath had hitched during that forbidden night in the library. Min-jae, what are you doing? Chloe Park's voice was a frantic, high-pitched screech. She's just a maid. She's a servant. You're ruining your suit for a... Min-jae's head snapped toward her, his eyes so dark they looked like twin voids. The air in the atrium seemed to drop another 10 degrees. She is not a maid, he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that carried to every corner of the silent mall. She is the woman who holds my heart. And from this moment, anyone who looks at her with anything less than total respect is declaring war on the Cheon family. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Beside him, Oh Seerin stood perfectly still, her face an unreadable mask of porcelain. The matriarch watched as her son, the coldest boss, publicly incinerated his reputation and his carefully guarded bachelorhood for a woman in a torn navy dress. Amaris clung to him, her fingers digging into the expensive fabric of his coat. Min-jae, she whispered, her voice trembling. Your mother, the people, everyone is watching. Let them watch, he replied, his gaze softening only when it met hers. I spent my life refusing to belong to anyone because I hadn't found the only person worth belonging to. I'm done hiding you in the shadows of my mother's house. He turned toward his security team, his expression shifting back into the ruthless commander. Take her to the car. Call my personal physician. If a single scar remains on her hands, I will hold this mall's board of directors personally responsible. As his men formed a protective canopy around them, Min-jae carried her toward the exit, stepping over the ruined designer bags and the shattered ornaments without a second glance. He wasn't just taking her to a doctor, he was taking her to his throne. The invisible girl was gone. In her place was a woman claimed by a king, and as the heavy glass doors hissed shut behind them, the world knew that the cold had finally, irrevocably, melted. The retribution began before the motorcade had even cleared the mall's parking garage. While Min-jae held Amaris in the back of the darkened sedan, his fingers tracing the bandages on her palms with a terrifying tenderness, his empire moved with the precision of a guillotine. He didn't need to bark orders, his men knew that the price of disrespect was not a fine, but total erasure. In the atrium, the silence was replaced by the sound of weeping. Chloe Park stood frozen as 3 men in black suits approached her, not with weapons, but with tablets. Within seconds, her phone began to scream with notifications. Her father's textile conglomerate, a staple of the Korean middle market, was being liquidated. Major investors were pulling out in a coordinated stampede, and by the time she looked up, her credit cards had been remotely deactivated. She was no longer an heiress, she was a girl in an expensive dress she could no longer afford to dry clean. You don't understand, Chloe sobbed, reaching for one of the guards. It was just a maid. It was a mistake. The guard didn't blink. You didn't insult a maid. You struck the future of the Cheon line. There are no mistakes in the underworld, Mississippi Park. Only consequences. The destruction rippled outward, ensnaring everyone who had laughed, everyone who had filmed, and everyone who had turned a blind eye. The mall's board of directors was summoned to an emergency meeting where they were forced to sign over a controlling interest to a Cheon subsidiary for pennies on the dollar. The socialites who had flanked Chloe found their family's secrets, tax evasion, illicit affairs, hidden debts, leaked to the press in a systematic bloodletting that dominated the evening news. Back at the estate, Min-jae sat in the dim light of his study, watching the digital collapse of Amoris's enemies on a wall of monitors. He looked like a god of ruin, his face illuminated by the flickering data of lives being dismantled. When a knock sounded at the door, he didn't turn. "Is it done?" he asked, his voice a jagged edge of ice. "They are ruined, sir," his lead enforcer replied. "The Park family is filing for bankruptcy. The others have been blacklisted from every social club in the country. They are invisible now." Min-jae finally turned, his eyes burning with a cold, dark satisfaction. "Good. Let them see how it feels to walk through a world that refuses to acknowledge your existence." He stood up, the weight of his power settling around him like a shroud. He had spent his life building a cage of isolation, but now he understood the true use of his crown. It wasn't for gold or territory. It was to ensure that the woman currently sleeping in his bed would never have to bleed on a marble floor again. The price had been paid in full, and the receipt was written in the ashes of a dozen reputations. The aftermath of the mall was not a victory lap, but a trial by fire within the silent corridors of the Cheon mansion. Amoris sat in the grand drawing room, her bandaged hands resting on a silk cushion that felt too soft for the grit she now felt in her soul. Across from her, Siren sat as still as an ancient statue, a cup of tea untouched on the low table between them. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of an impending storm. "My son has burnt half of Seoul to the ground for you today," Siren began, her voice a calm, terrifying silk. "He has traded his anonymity for a maid. He has made himself a target for every rival family who now knows his heart is no longer made of stone." Amoris didn't look down. The woman who had scrubbed these floors was gone, replaced by someone who had felt the weight of a king's protection. "He didn't do it for a maid, Lady O," Amoris replied, her voice steady despite the thrum of her heart. "He did it for the woman he loves. And if you believe that makes him weak, then you don't know your son as well as I do." Siren's eyes narrowed, a flash of something, perhaps respect, perhaps fury, glimmering in their depths. "Love is a luxury we cannot afford in this life. You are a girl from nowhere, with no lineage and no dowry. You are a liability. I am the only person in this world who doesn't want anything from him but his time," Amoris countered, leaning forward. "I have seen him at his weakest, and I didn't flinch. You want a queen who can handle the shadows? I've lived in them my whole life. I'm not afraid of the dark, and I'm certainly not afraid of you." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the moment the balance of power shifted. Siren looked at Amoris, really looked at her, seeing not the servant she had hired to polish her silver, but a woman who possessed a different kind of steel. The matriarch slowly picked up her tea, the porcelain clinking softly. "The girl I hired would have apologized for the broken ornaments," Siren said quietly, taking a sip. "The woman standing before me, she might actually survive being a Cheon." It wasn't an embrace, it was a truce. But as Siren rose and walked toward the door, she paused, her hand on the gilded handle. "The gala is tomorrow night. If you are to be his queen, do not embarrass me. The world will be looking for a maid. Show them a phoenix." As the door clicked shut, Amoris let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for years. She had survived the mall, she had survived the king's silence, and now, she had survived the Queen Mother. The challenge had been issued, and for the first time in her life, Amoris Vale was ready to be seen. The transformation was complete before Amoris even stepped out of the black sedan. Inside the penthouse overlooking the Han River, the modest navy dress had been traded for a gown of midnight silk that flowed around her like liquid shadows, its bodice encrusted with black diamonds that caught the light with every breath. Her hair was swept up in a regal crown, and on her finger sat a ring that held the weight of an empire. When she entered the grand ballroom of the Cheon Hotel for the winter gala, the air didn't just still, it shattered. The elite of Seoul, the same people who had whispered behind their hands at the mall, now stood in paralyzed silence. They weren't looking at a maid, they were looking at a legend. Min-jae was waiting for her at the base of the grand staircase. He looked every bit the coldest king, but the moment his eyes met hers, the ice vanished, replaced by a devotion so fierce it was almost tactile. He reached out, his scarred hand steady as he took hers, bringing her knuckles to his lips in a public vow that required no words. "You look like a queen," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. "I feel like myself," Amaris replied, her gaze unwavering as she looked out over the crowd. They moved through the ballroom as a single unit, a fortress of two. Oh Sierin stood on the far balcony, watching them with a glass of champagne in her hand. When their eyes met, the matriarch gave a single, imperceptible nod. It was the passing of the torch. The era of the solitary, frozen boss was over, the era of the matriarch had begun. Later that night, on the private terrace high above the glittering city lights, Min-jae pulled her into his arms. The cold wind whipped around them, but Amaris had never felt warmer. He reached into his pocket and produced a small, velvet box, but instead of more jewels, it contained a simple gold key, the key to the estate's main wing, a symbol of her total authority. "I told the world I refused to marry," Min-jae murmured against her hair. "I told them I didn't need anyone. I was a fool. I didn't need anyone else, I only needed you." He dropped to one knee, not out of weakness, but out of a strength that only love could forge. "Amaris Vale, you have already conquered my heart. Now, conquer this city with me. Marry me, officially, and let's show them what happens when the shadows finally step into the light." Amaris looked down at the man who had burned the world to protect her, then out at the city where she had once been invisible. She reached down, pulling him up to her level, her heart finally at peace. "Yes," she breathed, meeting his kiss with a fire that would never be extinguished. The maid was gone, the shadows had retreated, and as the snow began to fall over Seoul, a new queen took her throne.